Chapter 9. The Portuguese Carreira da Índia.
Black pepper is a deceptively simple agricultural product. Originating as the dried, unripe fruit of the flowering vine known to botanists as Piper nigrum, it is indigenous to the dense, tropical forests of the Malabar coast of India. In its natural environment, the vine grows quietly in the shade of umbrageous trees, producing small green berries that are painstakingly harvested between December and March. Yet by the time this wrinkled, dark spice reached the dining tables of the European elite in the 15th century, it had ceased to be a mere culinary seasoning. It was the undisputed engine of the global economy, a luxury commodity of staggering value and a highly sought-after medicinal preservative. For centuries before the arrival of European galleons, the journey of black pepper from the vines of Kerala to the markets of London or Venice was a marvel of medieval logistics. It moved through a deeply integrated, polycentric trading zone that spanned the entire Indian Ocean basin. This ancient maritime network operated on a predictable rhythm, dictated entirely by the seasonal shifting of the monsoon winds. Arab, Gujarati, and Malay merchants transported the spice in bulk, navigating a vast free trade network built on shared commercial law, complex credit systems, and mutual trust. There was no single empire that claimed sovereignty over the open water, allowing commerce to flow freely from port to port. From the western coast of India, the pepper was shipped across the Arabian Sea to the bustling ports of the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. Upon reaching the Middle East, the cargo was unloaded from ships and strapped to the backs of camels for the arduous overland caravan routes. This ancient terrestrial supply chain was long, incredibly slow, and heavily taxed by various land-based authorities. As the pepper passed through the territories of different warlords, princes, and eventually the powerful Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, it was subjected to numerous transit tolls and exorbitant customs duties. The final and most expensive bottleneck in this global supply chain was controlled by the Republic of Venice. Venetian merchants held a virtual monopoly on the distribution of eastern spices within the Mediterranean basin, acting as the sole intermediaries for the European continent. They purchased the pepper in the markets of Alexandria and the Levant, applying astronomical markups before selling it to buyers in northern and western Europe. By the late 15th century, the Portuguese crown looked at this multi-layered, highly exploitative supply chain and realized that bypassing it could yield unprecedented national wealth. They envisioned a direct, all-water route to India, an ambitious maritime endeavor that would ultimately take the form of a hostile, militarized corporate takeover. The Iberian obsession. The dream of outflanking the Venetian and Arab monopolies drove decades of painstaking Portuguese exploration down the uncharted western coast of Africa. Initiated under the visionary patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese state invested heavily in maritime technology, cartography, and navigational science. Year after year, Portuguese caravels pushed further south into the Atlantic, mapping the African coastline and establishing highly profitable trade networks in gold, ivory, and enslaved people. This incremental progress was driven by a singular, obsessive geopolitical goal: to find the southern tip of the African continent and turn east toward the Indian Ocean. The monumental breakthrough occurred in 1488 when the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias successfully rounded the treacherous Cape of Good Hope. This perilous voyage proved definitively that the African continent did not stretch infinitely southward, and that the Indian Ocean could indeed be accessed directly from the Atlantic. However, it would be nearly a decade before the Portuguese crown could organize the massive expedition required to actually cross the Indian Ocean and reach the source of the spice trade. Finally, King Manuel I of Portugal appointed a minor nobleman named Vasco da Gama to complete the mission, establish diplomatic contact, and open the markets of India. In July 1497, da Gama's small but heavily armed fleet, consisting of 4 ships including the flagship São Gabriel and the São Rafael, departed Lisbon on what would become one of the most consequential voyages in human history. This was not merely a journey of scientific exploration, it was a desperate race against time and a direct challenge to the existing global economic order. The voyage was agonizingly difficult, plagued by terrifying storms, navigational uncertainty, and catastrophic outbreaks of scurvy that decimated the crew. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope in November 1497, da Gama pressed northward along the eastern coast of Africa, entering waters completely unknown to European navigators. Along the East African coast, the Portuguese fleet secured vital assistance from local guides, notably in Malindi, who possessed deep knowledge of the monsoon wind patterns. With a skilled pilot aboard, da Gama finally launched his fleet across the open expanse of the Arabian Sea. In May 1498, history fractured when da Gama's battered ships dropped anchor off the coast of Calicut, a wealthy port city located on the Malabar coast of modern-day Kerala. For the very first time, a European vessel had bypassed the ancient overland routes and sailed directly into the beating heart of the Asian maritime economy, breaking the market, the trade imbalance. Calicut, ruled by a powerful Hindu monarch known by the title of Zamarin, was a sprawling cosmopolitan emporium of immense wealth and staggering diversity. Its vibrant markets were overflowing with fine cotton textiles, brilliant Chinese silks, precious gems, and towering mountains of the coveted black pepper. The Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who visited the region a century earlier, had astutely noted that pepper in Malabar was poured out for measuring by the bushel, as abundant as common grain. The Portuguese had finally arrived at the absolute source of the global spice trade, expecting to be welcomed as wealthy trading partners representing a dominant European monarch. Da Gama was eventually granted a formal audience with the Zamarin to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement and present the diplomatic gifts he had brought from the King of Portugal. The Portuguese had loaded their holds with what they considered to be respectable, valuable European commodities. Da Gama confidently presented the Zamarin with 12 pieces of striped wool cloth, 4 scarlet hoods, 6 hats, 4 strings of coral, several hand-wash basins, and wooden kegs filled with sugar, oil, and honey. They also brought simple trinkets, including crude iron tools and cheap glass beads, which had previously proven highly successful during their coastal African bartering expedition. When da Gama proudly presented this collection of goods to the Zamarin and his sophisticated Arab and Gujarati courtiers, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and deeply humiliating. The local merchants and royal advisors openly laughed at the display, viewing the offering as an insulting collection of virtually worthless trifles. The Zamarin's factors flatly informed da Gama that the poorest merchant traveling from Mecca routinely offered significantly richer gifts than those presented by the so-called King of Portugal. They bluntly stated that if da Gama wished to do business in the bustling markets of Calicut, he must pay in pure gold, as the king had absolutely no use for rough European wool or cheap glass beads. This disastrous diplomatic encounter triggered a severe macroeconomic shock, a sudden, paralyzing realization of Europe's extreme economic inferiority on the global stage. The Portuguese realized with terrifying clarity that they possessed almost nothing of material value to offer the highly developed, sophisticated markets of the East. The entire premise of their grand voyage had been based on a catastrophic miscalculation of global economic parity and market demand. Europe, quite simply, had nothing that Asia wanted to buy. This humiliation laid bare a stark geopolitical reality. Europe suffered from an insurmountable trade imbalance with the Indian Ocean economy. The Asian market was driven by high-value, high-quality manufactured goods, particularly Indian cottons and Chinese silks, alongside an insatiable, endless demand for precious metals. European manufactured goods, consisting mostly of heavy woolen garments completely unsuited for the tropical climate and primitive metallurgy, had absolutely no market in the East. If the Portuguese wanted to purchase black pepper, they could not rely on equitable barter or the exchange of manufactured goods. They would have to bleed massive amounts of gold and silver bullion directly into the Indian economy, a financial drain that the relatively poor Portuguese crown could not possibly sustain. Entering this ancient, highly lucrative market peacefully required deep reserves of capital that Lisbon simply did not possess. The Portuguese were faced with the stark binary choice: either abandon the spice trade to the established Muslim and Venetian merchants, or replace capital with sheer brute force. Because they could not buy their way into the global economy, the Portuguese consciously chose to weaponize their maritime presence. The architecture of a peaceful ocean. To successfully execute their violent pivot from merchants to conquerors, the Portuguese had to intimately understand the maritime environment they were attempting to dominate. Prior to 1498, the Indian Ocean functioned as a remarkably peaceful, highly integrated free trade zone, completely devoid of state-sponsored naval warfare, and was operated by a vast system of peddling markets, characterized by thousands of independent entrepreneurs conducting numerous peaceful transactions in small, mixed cargo lots. While terrestrial trade routes were heavily guarded and subject to the massive protection costs of local warlords, the open sea was largely demilitarized. There was no concept of a standing, state-sponsored naval fleet dedicated to controlling the shipping lanes of the Arabian Sea. The primary vessels utilized by the Arab, Gujarati, and Malay merchants were traditional dhows, beautifully engineered ships perfectly adapted to the predictable monsoon winds. These dhows were marvels of traditional maritime architecture, designed specifically for the efficient transport of bulk agricultural cargo across vast distances. Crucially, their hull planks were stitched together using highly durable coconut coir rope, allowing the ship to flex gracefully with the ocean swells without the need for a single iron nail. They were lightweight, incredibly fast, and highly capacious, but they completely lacked reinforced internal superstructures. Most importantly, these traditional merchant vessels carried absolutely no shipboard artillery or heavy weaponry. They were built for commerce, not for combat, relying on speed and the predictable seasonal winds to evade the sporadic, localized piracy that occasionally plagued the coastlines. The merchants who sailed them were businessmen, scholars, and navigators, operating within an Islamic legal framework that prioritized trust, credit, and reputation over military dominance. The Portuguese recognized this glaring systemic vulnerability immediately and moved to exploit it with ruthless, calculated efficiency. They consciously treated their expansion into the Indian Ocean not as a series of peaceful trading missions, but as a hostile, militarized corporate takeover. To achieve this unprecedented monopoly, they actively weaponized their maritime technology, transforming the traditional European cargo vessel into a floating fortress, a heavily armored naval artillery platform designed to project absolute power. This military hardware was engineered with a single, brutal purpose: to completely annihilate any opposition on the water and dictate the terms of trade through superior, unanswerable firepower. Militarized commerce, the artillery platform. The foundation of this floating fortress was rooted deeply in 15th century Iberian shipbuilding innovations, which prioritized structural resilience over mere cargo capacity. Unlike the elegantly stitched dhows of the East, the Portuguese galleons and naus carracks were constructed using massive, rigid wooden frames designed to withstand immense punishment. The thick exterior planks of these heavy ships were held together by thousands of forged iron nails, providing exceptional structural integrity and ballistic resistance. To prevent catastrophic leaks during the grueling multi-year voyages around the Cape of Good Hope, Portuguese shipwrights pioneered advanced, highly durable sealing techniques. They mixed lead directly into the structural seams of the hull and utilized a specialized caulking technique known as galagala paste. This galagala was a dense, highly durable putty produced by mixing traditional oakum with lime and olive oil, which was meticulously pressed between the heavy wooden planks. Once the seams were packed tight with this paste, the massive hulls were heavily coated in imported pitch and thick pine tar sourced in bulk from northern Germany. This extensive weatherproofing gave the Portuguese galleons their famous, sinister, dark tone, presenting a terrifying alien silhouette on the horizon of the Indian Ocean. These ships were incredibly resilient, designed to absorb the punishing swells of the deep ocean and easily deflect the primitive low-velocity projectiles utilized by local defensive forces. However, the true terror of the Portuguese galleon was not its ability to absorb damage, but its unprecedented mechanized capacity to inflict it. The ultimate weaponization of the Portuguese hull was the result of decades of deliberate military engineering driven by the Portuguese crown. Decades prior to da Gama's voyage, King John II of Portugal had pioneered the introduction of heavily reinforced internal decks on his early caravels. These massive structural crossbeams were specifically engineered to absorb the immense downward weight and the violent rearward recoil of heavy naval ordnance. Furthermore, the Portuguese eagerly adopted and perfected the revolutionary innovation of cutting square gun ports, known as portinholas, directly into the sides of the ship's lower hull. This architectural breakthrough allowed them to mount massive heavy cannons much lower to the waterline, drastically improving the ship's center of gravity and preventing it from capsizing under the weight of its own weapons. The Portuguese crown spared absolutely no expense in acquiring the finest, most destructive military technology available in Europe. They systematically replaced older, unreliable wrought iron breech loaders with highly accurate, exceptionally durable bronze cannons cast in Central Europe and Flanders. These heavy bronze guns could sustain repeated, high-velocity firing without fracturing, allowing a single galleon to unleash a devastating, continuous volume of fire. To operate these complex weapons, King John II introduced standardized teams of highly trained, specialized naval gunners, known as bombarderos, on every single ship in the fleet. These bombarderos were frequently foreign mercenaries, particularly Germans, who were lured to the Portuguese royal service by premium wages and the explicit promise of plunder. Armed with these dark-hulled floating fortresses, the Portuguese initiated a profound, bloody revolution in naval warfare tactics. For centuries, European maritime combat had been defined by the medieval strategy of rush and grapple, where galleys would violently ram each other to facilitate bloody, hand-to-hand infantry combat on the decks. The Portuguese completely abandoned this outdated strategy upon entering the Indian Ocean, choosing instead to leverage their overwhelming technological asymmetry. They utilized the broadside cannonade, a tactic that allowed them to resolve naval engagements entirely through superior gunnery, standing off at a safe distance, completely out of range of enemy arrows or primitive grappling hooks. A Portuguese galleon could simply pivot and unleash a coordinated wall of bronze cannon fire. This tactic allowed them to systemically destroy the unarmed merchantiles of the Arabian Sea with absolute, terrifying impunity. The heavy iron-cast cannonballs easily splintered the thin, coy-stitched planks of the regional trading vessels, sending tons of valuable pepper and thousands of sailors to the bottom of the ocean. The Portuguese utilized this asymmetrical warfare to terrorize coastal cities, repeatedly bombarding defenseless ports until local rulers agreed to highly unfavorable monopolistic trade concessions. By transforming their ships into mobile artillery platforms, the Portuguese realized a dark geopolitical truth: they did not need a superior economic product to dominate the global spice trade. They did not need to offer better prices, higher quality textiles, or more reliable credit networks than their Arab competitors. They simply needed to monopolize the application of extreme maritime violence, ensuring that any merchant who refused to trade on Portuguese terms would be violently erased from the market. This policy of militarized commerce fundamentally permanently shattered the peaceful peddling networks of the Indian Ocean.
The spatial strategy of Albuquerque.
Despite their overwhelming tactical superiority on the water, the Portuguese High Command quickly realized that roaming fleets of heavily armed galleons were not enough to permanently control a global industry. The Indian Ocean was simply too vast, and the traditional peddling trade too decentralized to be managed purely by intercepting individual ships at sea. The architecture of a true, lasting monopoly required a grand strategic vision that paired naval artillery with permanent, fortified terrestrial bases. This aggressive vision was formulated and ruthlessly executed by Afonso de Albuquerque, the second viceroy of Portuguese India, who is widely considered the true architect of the Portuguese seaborne empire. Albuquerque understood a fundamental geopolitical reality. To completely control the open ocean, a power must control the strategic land at its edges. He recognized that the flow of black pepper and fine spices was naturally funneled through specific, narrow geographical bottlenecks due to the physical shape of the Asian continent. He designed a comprehensive spatial strategy centered on aggressively capturing and heavily fortifying these vital maritime choke points with impenetrable stone fortresses. By physically dominating these narrow straits, a relatively small contingent of Portuguese warships could effectively dictate the terms of trade for half the globe. Albuquerque specifically targeted three primary locations, each acting as an indispensable valve in the ancient circulatory system of the global economy. The strategic value of these three primary Portuguese choke points was absolute, and their capture fundamentally rewired the flow of global commodities. Goa, captured 1510, located midway along the western coast of India, Goa provided the Portuguese with a naturally sheltered, easily defensible inner harbour, perfectly suited for a permanent, large-scale naval base. Its central position physically divided the primary pepper-producing regions of the Malabar coast to the south from the wealthy textile-producing markets of Gujarat to the north. Furthermore, Goa was the primary port of entry for the highly lucrative Arabian horse trade, a vital military commodity required by inland Indian sultanates to maintain their cavalry forces. By capturing Goa and establishing it as the heavily fortified capital of the Estado da Índia, Albuquerque secured a permanent shipbuilding center and administrative hub directly on the subcontinent, allowing Portuguese galleons to effortlessly project power up and down the Indian seaboard. Malacca, captured funded 2011. The exceptionally wealthy port city of Malacca commanded the narrow Strait of Malacca, a singular, indispensable maritime gateway connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Every ounce of nutmeg, mace, and clove originating from the distant Spice Islands, alongside every shipment of silk and porcelain from China, was physically required to pass through this narrow corridor. By bombarding the city into submission and erecting a massive stone fortress known as Formosa, Albuquerque effectively monopolized the distribution of Far Eastern luxury goods before they ever reached the Indian Ocean. Controlling Malacca allowed the Portuguese to place their hand directly on the throat of the global spice trade, physically blockading the flow of goods that traditionally supplied the Arab merchants and, ultimately, the Republic of Venice. Hormuz, captured 1515. Situated on a barren, sun-baked island at the very mouth of the Persian Gulf, Hormuz was a remarkably wealthy nexus for the ancient overland caravan trade. It completely controlled maritime access to the vital terrestrial routes leading through Iran, Basra, and Baghdad, which ultimately fed the bustling markets of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant. Albuquerque captured Hormuz specifically to enforce a physical blockade against the traditional Persian and Arab merchant networks that had controlled the flow of spices to Europe for centuries. With Portuguese bronze cannons directly overlooking the narrow strait, the flow of black pepper to the Ottoman Empire and subsequently to the Venetian monopoly was severely restricted, fundamentally starving the ancient supply chains of the Middle East. By securing these three heavily fortified choke points, Albuquerque successfully completed an iron ring around the perimeter of the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese did not need to conquer vast, heavily populated inland empires or manage complex terrestrial economies to extract wealth. They simply sat at the geographical turnstiles of global commerce, relying on their floating fortresses to ensure that no valuable cargo moved without their explicit permission. This brilliant, violent spatial strategy successfully severed the traditional arteries of the Asian economy, setting the perfect stage for the implementation of a massive bureaucratic system of systemic extortion. The Cartaz system, the protection racket. With their naval artillery platforms established and the critical geographical choke points securely under their control, the Portuguese initiated the final, most lucrative phase of their hostile takeover. They transitioned from a strategy of raw military conquest to one of highly systematized bureaucratic extortion. This was achieved through the creation and ruthless enforcement of the Cartaz system. The Cartaz was a mandatory naval passport, a physical document issued by the Portuguese authorities that effectively transformed the Indian Ocean spice trade into a massive state-run maritime protection racket. The legal justification for the implementation of the Cartaz was rooted in a breathtakingly audacious European legal fiction known as mare clausum, or the closed sea. Ignoring centuries of established free trade tradition in Asia, the Portuguese crown unilaterally declared absolute, divine sovereignty over the entirety of the Indian Ocean. Under this self-proclaimed heavily armed authority, Portugal decreed that no merchant vessel, regardless of its origin, historical right, or religious affiliation, could navigate these waters without purchasing an official Portuguese license. They effectively privatized the ocean, aggressively forcing all regional merchants to purchase a license to navigate their own waters or face being summarily sunk. The actual mechanics of this maritime protection racket were ruthlessly simple and heavily bureaucratic. A local Indian or Arab merchant captain preparing for a routine commercial voyage was forced to anchor his vessel at a Portuguese-controlled port, such as Goa, Diu, or Malacca, and pay a substantial fee in silver or gold to acquire the Cartaz. This document was highly specific, intentionally designed to strip the independent merchants of their traditional commercial flexibility. It explicitly dictated the ship's approved port of origin and destination, the exact nature and volume of its cargo, and the specific names of its captain and crew members. Most importantly, the Cartaz contained strict, non-negotiable prohibitions regarding what the independent merchant was legally allowed to carry. Merchants operating under a Cartaz were strictly forbidden from trading in any goods officially declared as Portuguese crown monopolies. This prohibited list primarily included the most lucrative commodities: black pepper, fine spices, heavy munitions, and Arabian horses. By legally restricting the transport of these high-value items, the Portuguese ensured that the most profitable sectors of the global economy were reserved entirely for their own royal fleets. Local merchants were consequently relegated to trading low-margin, bulk goods such as rice, timber, and common textiles, fundamentally crippling their ability to generate significant wealth. To physically enforce this massive ocean-wide extortion scheme, the Portuguese deployed specialized, highly aggressive coastal patrol fleets known as the Armadas da Costa. These roving squadrons of heavily armed galleons prowled the established shipping lanes, aggressively intercepting, boarding, and inspecting almost every merchant dhow they encountered on the open water. The Armadas de Costa acted as the militarized enforcers of the Estado da Índia, ensuring that the theoretical bureaucratic power of the Cartaz was backed by the very real threat of bronze cannons. If a vessel was intercepted without a valid pass, or found to be carrying prohibited monopoly goods hidden among its cargo, the retaliation was absolute and terrifying. The Portuguese did not view these local violators as mere smugglers. They officially classified them as violent pirates and state insurgents, justifying extreme punitive measures. The illicit cargo, whether it was a few bags of black pepper or a fortune in raw Chinese silk, was immediately confiscated to enrich the local Portuguese officials and fill the royal treasury in Lisbon. The merchant ship itself was frequently stripped of any remaining valuables and then either burned to the waterline or violently sunk by point-blank cannon fire. The unarmed crews of these intercepted vessels were routinely subjected to horrific, institutionalized violence as a dark warning to the wider merchant community. They were routinely slaughtered directly on the decks of their own ships, physically mutilated and sent back to port as a warning, or taken captive and sold into the global slave trade. This system of extreme, normalized brutality ensured total market compliance through sheer, unadulterated terror. The Portuguese had successfully engineered a system where the cost of doing business in the Indian Ocean included paying a direct tax to the very military force that threatened to destroy you. It was, by every modern economic definition, a highly organized mafia enterprise masquerading as a royal trade monopoly, the bureaucracy of extortion. The terrifying genius and the profound tragedy of the Cartaz system lay in its sheer economic efficiency. The Portuguese managed to extract immense unearned wealth from an ancient trading network without actually contributing to its productive agricultural or manufacturing capacity. They did not cultivate the pepper vines in the highlands of Kerala, they did not weave the brilliant cotton textiles of Gujarat, and they rarely offered competitive, fair market prices for the goods they aggressively demanded. Instead, they simply sold localized protection from their own devastating military forces. In classic mafia fashion, the Portuguese purposefully created a violent, existential threat and then charged local merchants a heavy premium to avoid it. They successfully internalized the high protection costs that had previously been scattered across the terrestrial caravan routes, centralizing the global extortion under the banner of the Portuguese crown. To further tighten their bureaucratic stranglehold on regional commerce, the Portuguese eventually expanded the Cartaz system by instituting the highly restrictive kafila system. The kafila mandate required all independent Indian Ocean merchants to group their fragile dhows into massive, highly regulated convoys before setting sail. These sprawling maritime convoys were then legally mandated to travel under the heavily armed escort of Portuguese warships, ostensibly to protect them from the very pirates the Portuguese had largely invented. In reality, the captive merchants were forced to pay exorbitant additional fees for this unwanted coercive escort. Furthermore, the kafila system served a much darker, highly lucrative administrative purpose for the Estado da Índia, ensured that all regional maritime trade was physically corralled and funneled directly into specific, heavily fortified Portuguese customs houses. By physically forcing the massive convoys to anchor at ports like Goa, Cochin, or Diu, the Portuguese could systematically assess, weigh, and extract heavy duties on all legitimate, non-monopolized cargo. This inescapable bureaucratic strangulation slowly choked the vibrant, independent trading trade that had thrived in the Indian Ocean for centuries prior to 1498. Local merchants, previously accustomed to free navigation, fluid alliances, and highly flexible markets, found their historical profit margins completely eradicated by the sheer weight of Portuguese taxes, licenses, and forced military escorts. The once polycentric cooperative trading zone was systematically reduced to a heavily monitored, militarized extraction economy entirely managed from Lisbon. The collapse of the ancient supply chain. The economic ripple effects of this maritime protection racket extended far beyond the tropical shores of India and Southeast Asia. The traditional terrestrial powers of the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin experienced severe, cascading macroeconomic shocks as the Portuguese systematically tightened their grip on the ocean. The powerful Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which had long relied on the heavy taxation of spices transiting the Red Sea to fund its massive military and administrative apparatus, found its primary source of revenue suddenly and permanently evaporating.
As the historical flow of black pepper through the markets of Cairo slowed to a mere trickle, the Mamluk economy collapsed, leaving them highly vulnerable to conquest by the expanding Ottoman Empire. Simultaneously, the Republic of Venice, the undisputed master of European spice distribution for centuries, faced a total, existential economic crisis. For generations, magnificent Venetian galleys had routinely purchased vast quantities of black pepper in Alexandria and the Levant, allowing the city-state to dictate prices to the rest of the European continent. However, as Albuquerque's fortified choke points at Malacca and Hormuz effectively blockaded the traditional Arab supply chains, the Venetians were violently starved of their economic lifeblood.
Prices in the Mediterranean skyrocketed as desperate scarcity set in, causing panic among the merchant elites of the Italian city-states. Conversely, the previously marginal markets in Lisbon began to flood with heavily guarded shipments of Carreira da Índia pepper, selling at prices the Venetians could no longer match. The economic center of gravity in Europe decisively and permanently shifted away from the enclosed Mediterranean basin and moved to the shores of the Atlantic seaboard. The Portuguese had successfully achieved what seemed utterly impossible during da Gama's humiliating, poverty-stricken audience in Calicut just a few decades prior.
Lacking the gold to participate fairly in the free market, they had utilized their floating fortresses to violently restructure the entire global economy in their direct favor. By aggressively grafting a state-sponsored protection racket over a thriving, ancient commercial network, they successfully redirected the immense wealth of the East around the Cape of Good Hope. The Carreira da Índia was not a triumph of superior European manufacturing, nor was it an organic, peaceful evolution of free market capitalism. It was the direct result of a hostile, militarized corporate takeover that consciously weaponized maritime technology to extort the world's most valuable agricultural commodity. The humble black pepperberry had triggered the birth of a new, exceptionally violent era of global trade, the economic reality of the pepper trade. To truly understand the sheer scale of the wealth generated by this militarized monopoly, one must examine the stark, underlying economics of the black pepper trade during the 16th century. The profit margins involved in moving spices from India to Europe were so astronomically high that they frequently bordered on the absurd, driving the Portuguese crown to justify almost any level of maritime violence. This economic reality was the foundational engine that funded the entire Estado da Índia, paying for the massive stone fortresses, the bronze cannons, and the sprawling bureaucracy required to maintain the Cartaz system. In the early years of the 16th century, the Portuguese purchasing agents on the Malabar coast typically acquired raw black pepper from local cultivators, or coerced middlemen, at a heavily depressed, monopolistic rate. Historical records indicate that the Portuguese frequently forced the sale of pepper at a fixed price of approximately 2.5 cruzados per quintal. This price was artificially held low through the constant threat of naval bombardment and the systemic elimination of competing Arab buyers from the market. The local Indian cultivators, who had previously enjoyed robust competition among buyers, were severely economically disadvantaged by this forced monopsony. However, once that same quintal of black pepper survived the perilous 6-month journey around the Cape of Good Hope and was unloaded at the Casa da Índia in Lisbon, its value exploded. That exact same volume of spice, purchased for 2.5 cruzados in India, routinely sold in the markets of Europe for anywhere between 50 to 80 cruzados. This represented a staggering gross profit margin that could easily exceed 2,000% on a single successful voyage, even after accounting for the massive overhead costs of the Carreira da Índia, including the construction of the galleons, the wages of the bombarderos, the high rate of shipwrecks, and the maintenance of the overseas fortresses. The net profits were simply astronomical. This spectacular influx of wealth fundamentally transformed the Kingdom of Portugal, elevating it from a marginal, impoverished state on the periphery of Europe into one of the wealthiest global empires in history. It financed the construction of magnificent cathedrals, sprawling royal palaces, and the continued expansion of their naval dominance. Yet this wealth was built entirely upon a fragile foundation of systemic violence and forced market manipulation. The Portuguese did not create a more efficient global supply chain. They simply inserted themselves as heavily armed middlemen, using extortion and terror to siphon the natural wealth of the Indian Ocean directly into the royal coffers of Lisbon. Conclusion. The bloody history of the Portuguese Carreira da Índia is the history of a profound, violent, and permanent global disruption. The initial arrival of Vasco da Gama in Calicut in 1498 exposed a glaring, humiliating trade imbalance, revealing that Europe possessed absolutely nothing of material value to offer the sophisticated, wealthy economies of Asia. Faced with this stark macroeconomic reality, the Portuguese crown did not attempt to innovate their domestic manufacturing or engage in equitable, peaceful trade. Instead, they consciously chose to weaponize their advanced naval architecture, pivoting violently from hopeful merchants to ruthless maritime conquerors. By intelligently combining highly durable, iron-nailed hulls with highly destructive, long-range bronze cannons, they transformed the standard European merchant ship into an unmatched instrument of global coercion. Through the brilliant, ruthless strategic genius of Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese methodically captured the vital geographical choke points of Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. This spatial strategy allowed them to physically blockade the ancient, established supply chains that had fed the Middle East and Venice for centuries. Upon this unshakable foundation of absolute military supremacy, they erected the Cartaz system, a mandatory naval passport that formalized and bureaucratized their maritime extortion. This state-sponsored protection racket aggressively forced regional Indian and Arab merchants to actively fund their own subjugation, transforming the peaceful free trade zone of the Indian Ocean into a militarized extraction economy. The lasting legacy of the Portuguese naval expansion is not merely the scientific discovery of a sea route to India, but the dark genesis of modern state-sponsored militarized commerce. In this brutal New World Order, the ultimate, most profitable commodity was not black pepper, silk, or gold, but the absolute monopoly of maritime violence itself.